Ladies and gentlemen, time to get started. Our guest today is Jean Yarbrough, who's a professor of government at Bowdoin College and also a professor of the social sciences at Bowdoin College. It's kind of an overlay or underlay of government and social sciences. She's written this wonderful new book, Theodore Roosevelt and the American Political Tradition, which won the Richard Neustadt Award for 2013 from the American Political Science Association. Richard Neustadt is a name well known around here. He was professor of government at Harvard for many years. He was in the John F. Kennedy White House, and then wrote, I guess, what was the most famous book and perhaps still is the most famous book on the presidency. So you're the Neustadt Award. And Jean has also written a book on Thomas Jefferson, most recently The Essential Jefferson, which is a book she edited, but her book on Jefferson is called American Virtues, Thomas Jefferson and the Character of a Free People. She got her bachelor's degree from Cedar Crest College in Allentown, PA, and then her advanced degrees from the graduate faculty of the New School for Social Research in New York City. She's going to talk today on her book, or at least on the subject of her book, Teddy Roosevelt and the American Political Tradition. So, Jean.
This is here? Do I need this? It's okay? Okay. Thank you, Harvey. Thank you, Anna and Andy Zwick, for putting together this occasion. It's really lovely to be here and to see old friends and people I don't know but expect to hear from at some point in the next hour. I thought that what I would do is just tell you a little bit about the overall theme of my book. My book is a study of Theodore Roosevelt's political thought, and there are echoes of a response to Richard Hofstadter there because I call the book Theodore Roosevelt and the American Political Tradition, which was part of the title of Hofstadter's book, The American Political Tradition and the Men Who Made It, which includes essays on Lincoln, Roosevelt, the Federalist, and so on. Surprisingly, there have been very few studies of Roosevelt's political thought, probably because he's so much better known for his life of frenetic activity, and because he provides so much for biographers and historians. What I've tried to do here is to argue that Roosevelt wanted to place himself in the tradition of strong nationalists such as George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and above all, Abraham Lincoln. And he frequently invoked them in order to associate himself with them. But what I argue after I look at their thought is that his thought actually strayed from theirs. And in doing so, a second purpose of the book overall is to challenge the progressive narrative, which is so entrenched after 100 years, that the kinds of crises that America faced at the turn of the last century, or the 19th century, were so severe that it was really necessary for American presidents and would-be American statesmen to turn away from the founders because their political thought was somehow obsolete. And that is what I try to challenge in my book, and to argue that had Roosevelt remained faithful to the principles of the men he claimed he admired, that he would have pursued a very different course. Given Harvey's own institute and his emphasis and his interest in constitutionalism, I thought that would be what I would focus my comments on today. And it comes in three parts. First, since we're at Harvard, I thought I'd say something about his undergraduate Harvard education. And here I have to say that the Harvard archives are nonpareil. There is so much in those Harvard archives so much information that you can get. And one of the interesting things was to go back and look at the catalogs for the years in which Roosevelt was a student here, and even the year before when he was applying to Harvard, because they give you examples of the kinds of essay questions they want you to answer on tests. They give you the 2-day comprehensive admissions exams for which you sit in order to be admitted to Harvard. They're really a treasure trove of interesting information. And one of the things that I discovered is that in the sophomore year at Harvard, everyone was required to take a course called Anglo-American Constitutional History. And there were 3 assigned books, the first of which was A.E. Freeman's little survey of English constitutionalism. And this started with, and I ask my students when I mention this, well, where do you think a survey of English constitutionalism would begin? Magna Carta, perhaps? Well, the answer in Freeman's case was in pre-Socratic Greece, because what he does is study the rise of the Aryan race and its division in particular into the Teutonic tribes. And the ones that he's particularly enamored of are the Teutonic tribes who escaped domination under the Roman Empire. And that would be the Scandinavians, certain Low Dutch, German tribes, and then the English, and through the English, the Americans. It's a bizarre course, I think. The second book, we're so critical of the content of a lot of courses in today's universities, but this one is a real howler. Then there was a course on the contemporary English Constitution, and then there was finally a course on the American Constitution written by a man who was an expert in fire insurance law. It makes for fairly dull reading, and he is in many ways a precursor to the Corwin approach, where he goes through line by line the Constitution and what it meant to him. And what he emphasized was the centrality of the Senate. He was critical of Abraham Lincoln for suspending the writ of habeas corpus, and he said nothing about the Emancipation Proclamation. Basically, he saw the president as a kind of executor in the narrow sense of the term, and saw all the action really focused in the legislature and especially in the Senate. What's interesting is that nowhere in this course on Anglo-American constitutionalism did Roosevelt read anything about the men he claimed most to admire, not Washington, not Lincoln, not Alexander Hamilton, and not the Federalist. He then went on, after graduating, to the Columbia Law School, where he fell under the spell of John Burgess, who did know something about social science. He was an admirer of the German state, the new German state. He had been in Germany at the time of German unification, and he admired all things German, and especially Hegel. In particular, he admired the way the German jurists combined elements of English common law and Roman law in the new imperial legal codes. And following in this example, Burgess would attempt to weave elements of German idealism into his course on comparative constitutional law. And here I'd like to read you what Burgess, in his 2-volume history of comparative constitutional law, what Burgess concluded was the final and ultimate end of the state. Once the national genius of the different states had been developed, and now I'm reading directly from Burgess, developed and perfected and made objective in customs, laws, and institutions, the state could then advance to its universal and ultimate end, which was the perfection of humanity, the civilization of the world, the perfect development of human reason, and its attainment of universal command over individualism, the apotheosis of man. This end is wholly spiritual, and in it mankind as spirit triumphs over all fleshly weakness, error, and sin. Leaving no doubt of the provenance of this argument, Burgess immediately added, "This is what Hegel meant by the doctrine that morality, Sittlichkeit, is the end of the state." So perhaps it is not surprising that TR's education did not provide him with a firm grasp of American politics and constitutionalism. Yet all the time in the 1890s, Roosevelt ran around exhorting young college men, because that's basically what they were in those days, young college men to read the Federalist Papers, because as far as he was concerned, this was the best book ever written on practical politics. When he read it, I don't know. How well he read it, how well he understood its arguments, I have reason to question. I'd like now, having just taken you through that whirlwind tour of some of the highlights of Roosevelt's education, to look briefly at his term as president. Roosevelt is famous for having developed what he would later call his stewardship theory of the American presidency. Edwin Corwin called it his stewardship theory of the American presidency. Roosevelt did not come up with that term during his presidency. He only first coined it in his New Nationalism speech in 1910. And he explained in his autobiography, published in 1913, what it was that he understood the stewardship theory to be. He wrote, and this was in reference to the his mediation and resolution of the coal strike of 1902 when he was president. "Occasionally great national crises arise which call for immediate and vigorous action, and that in such cases it is the duty of the president to act upon the theory that he is the steward of the people, and that the proper attitude for him to take is that he is bound to assume that he has the legal right to do whatever the needs of the people demand, unless the Constitution or laws explicitly forbid him to do it." So this was the stewardship theory of the Constitution. TR, in explaining this in his autobiography, claimed that he was following in the footsteps of Jackson and Lincoln, and that his presidency was modeled on theirs. His was an active presidency, and it required men of great, bold temperament. He tried to pitch it as an interpretation, a broad interpretation of executive powers against the alternative, which he described as a narrow, legalistic interpretation. But the stewardship theory is a good deal more. Lincoln cited constitutional grounds for the arguments that he took in the Emancipation Proclamation, in suspending the writ of habeas corpus. He did not claim that he could do anything that was not expressly forbidden. When he took measures that might have been unconstitutional, he did so because he had taken an oath to preserve the Constitution, which required him to save the Union. He was engaged in an actual civil war. Roosevelt, by contrast, regarded the coal strike of 1902 as the moral equivalent of a civil war. And so he thought that he needed to act as if the country were engaged in a civil war. Nor did he try to defend his actions with reference to the Constitution or Article 2. Instead, he sought to get around the Constitution to satisfy the needs of the nation. And according to one historian, within a year he was describing his actions with reference to the Constitution, claiming that, without reference to the Constitution, claiming that as head of the nation, he obeyed a supreme law of duty to the Republic. He doesn't say where that came from, probably deep within himself. What's more, although he did not want to routinize emergencies, and he was aware that in responding to this emergency, that this might give rise for him to demands for him to intervene in other emergencies. In fact, this is what he would do, particularly in the field of conservation, where toward the end of his presidency, he warned of famines in wood, oil, and other natural resources, and used this as a reason to argue for the expansion of the powers of the federal government, and especially the executive, to act on behalf of the needs of the nation. And then, so this is the stewardship theory of his presidency, which he, on reflection, while he's in the White House, the idea that he floated was that the federal government had inherent powers to act on behalf of the nation. But the Supreme Court rejected that view, and so he then developed or offered what remained one of his legacies, which was the stewardship theory of presidential power, which he then expanded on in the New Nationalism and the Progressive Party platform. In the New Nationalism, which he developed in 1910 after he had stepped down from the presidency, gone on his safari, visited all the capitals of Europe. He returned having read Herbert Crowley's book, The Promise of American Life, and what I try to argue in my book, or what I do argue in my book, is that Crowley really provided him with good and far more radical arguments for the kind of policies that he already envisioned while he was president. So while many historians think that Crowley was really influenced by TR, it all depends what you're looking for. If what you're looking for are policies, TR was clearly the leader. If what you're looking for are justifications for those policies, then TR really helped Roosevelt to strengthen and develop the justification for his new nationalism. The first thing about the new nationalism was that it offered up a new conception of property rights. In place of the time-honored right of the individual to property, Roosevelt argued that wealth must now benefit the community or render service to the nation. He had been saying that for some years, but he finally gets around to saying what he means by benefit and service. He did not mean an improved standard of living. He did not mean technological innovation. He did not mean philanthropic associations, hospitals, museums, universities. What he meant, quite simply, was social justice or the redistribution of wealth. Even if people rendered service to the nation, he went on to say, if they were overpaid, they should be giving some of that back. And of course, it would be the executive as steward of the nation that would decide this. TR, once he began to think seriously about challenging Taft in the 1912 election, continued to argue that the executive was the steward of the people, empowered to take whatever actions the people, now aroused by progressive journals and newspapers, whatever they would demand. And in order to do this, he championed the rise of executive or administrative agencies in the executive branch, or later independent agencies. What he hoped to do with administrative agencies was to overcome the obstacles of the separation of powers and federalism. This was what was wrong with the original Constitution. It placed too many obstacles in the way of the kind of demands that the people wanted, and that Roosevelt wanted to see them receive. The administrative agencies, Roosevelt's view of the administrative agencies was compared to Woodrow Wilson, and this was something I was quite surprised to learn, was the most top-down and statist. Between the two of them, his required the most command and control of the economy, not Woodrow Wilson, but Theodore Roosevelt. He wanted to set schedules, prices, and pretty much to try to regulate as much of the economy as he could. And his model was the kind of regulation that he sought for the railroads, even though the railroads were common carriers invested with a public purpose. He wanted to extend that kind of regulation throughout the industrial sector of the economy. Obviously, Roosevelt had enormous faith in impartial experts who, now armed with the new tools of social science, would be able to put into practice their lofty aims and ideals. And so he kept, for Roosevelt, looking at the kind of men he wanted to attract to government. He had enormous faith that somehow men of lofty ideals would do the right thing, act in the right way, use their social science knowledge in order to give the people what was good for them and what the people wanted. So again, he also assumed that what the people wanted and what the administrators perceived was the common good were basically in alignment with each other. Roosevelt, to put this view, his new constitutionalism into practice, Roosevelt, of course, mounted an attack upon the judiciary. And this was, in fact, what led his earlier supporters, Elihu Root and Henry Cabot Lodge, among others, to declare that they could not support him in the election of 1912. What they thought was that his attacks on the judiciary, and here his attacks, although he was angry with the Knight decision and incensed with the Lochner decision of 1905, most of the decisions that really exercised him were at the state level. And what he called for was the recall of judicial decisions. He was not opposed to the recall of even the judges themselves, but his first response was to say the people ought to be able to recall or overturn judicial decisions that blocked progressive reforms. As he confided privately, however, he also would have backed seeing this kind of recall system extended to the federal judiciary. But that far he was not willing to go publicly. And it was this issue more than any other that caused the progressive Republicans who had backed him previously and served in his administration to back Taft and to walk away from his candidacy. What Roosevelt called for was that judges act not on the basis of legal reasoning. Legal justice, he said, was not enough. What we needed now was ethical justice. And in the service of ethical justice, he was willing to look at sociological jurisprudence, to rely on social science, to look at pragmatism, whatever got you to your goal was fine with him. But they had to be men of forward-looking disposition, not those who looked back to the now obsolete principles of the founders, or the men of the 18th century. He never really said the founders, just the men of the 18th century. He also called for direct democratic reforms, and these, together with the administrative agencies, formed what I describe as a pincer movement against the framers' constitutionalism. And I was delighted to see this morning that Yuval Levin had a piece talking about criticizing both Republican populism, trying to shut down the government for the sake of repealing Obamacare, and Obamacare itself and the failure of these administrative agencies. What both of these two things together, and you can see this in the original progressive platform, was that one way to circumvent the Constitution was, on the one hand, to have direct democracy, where the people could, by means of initiatives, referenda, and judicial recall, overturn the decisions, the reactionary decisions with which they disagreed. So that's one half of it. And then the other half of the attack on the original constitutional order was to have administrative agencies that could circumvent or overcome the limitations of both the separation of powers and federalism. Levin does, as I do as well in my book, call attention to Federalist 63, where Madison writes that the principal difference between American republicanism and the ancient republican world was the total exclusion of the people in their collective capacity from any share in government. And so from that perspective, having initiatives, referenda, judicial recall certainly seems to be out of step with the framers' thinking, which was that representation would establish a space between the people and their representatives, so that the representatives could deliberate about the common good rather than simply respond to the wishes of their constituents. Roosevelt, of course, also supported an income tax which would fund the welfare state, and called in 1912 for a new contract with the people, a new social contract. It's often said that this was what FDR did in the Commonwealth Club address, but in fact, it's right there in the Progressive Party platform of 1912, and FDR, who studied very carefully the moves of his cousin Theodore Roosevelt, and who took the exact same path to the White House except for the party affiliation, called as well for a new social compact. As a result of all these changes, Roosevelt was charged with betraying the cause of constitutionalism. And in response, he declared himself an emphatic believer in constitutionalism, and that he was only opposed to a false constitutionalism that tried to trick the people out of their rights. Be that as it may, it was not the Constitution of the men he claimed to admire, or the Constitution which the Federalists defended, the book he had once recommended to college men to read. And here I will just close by making a few general points about what some of the differences between Roosevelt and the Federalist Papers and the framers he admired are. First, they had a very different theory of human nature. The Federalist believed that men were self-interested and that reason was fallible. They had very little faith in high-minded administrators, especially administrators freed from political accountability. It was true that they hoped that the presidency would encourage such virtues as magnanimity and courage, but they did not simply rely, as Madison said famously, on enlightened statesmen, which seemed to be what Roosevelt was calling for with his emphasis on men of high ideals who would man these administrative agencies, which would be increasingly unmoored from the separation of powers and constitutional limitations. The founders had no confidence that human nature could, as a general rule, evolve toward disinterested action. And yet this, I think, was exactly what Roosevelt was calling for, not just that there would be a few exemplary human beings, such as George Washington, but that everyone ought to be able to become more disinterested and act on the basis of disinterestedness. He also, although he defended representation, I think that he did not adequately appreciate the need for deliberation and the space that was required for deliberation. Sometimes he defended his direct democratic reforms as a way of circumventing the corruption that had crept into the system, but in other places he seemed to think that it was really a better replacement for the old representative system. The framers were worried about majority faction, and especially majority faction where property was concerned. The few and the many, the rich and the poor, the many who are poor or not rich, making inroads on the rights of the property of the wealthy. It is true that at the end of the 19th century, there was another worry, which was minority tyranny, but majority faction remains a permanent danger in a democratic republic. It is not, as he said of Taft, that in reminding citizens, voters, of majority faction, that Taft was evincing an unhealthy dread of the people. And finally, Roosevelt no longer felt the need for a limited government whose purpose would be to protect rights. He spoke mostly now about rights as they were involved in duties and not just rights themselves. He also did not really see the need for a vibrant private and social sphere where people would be free to govern themselves and to exercise their talents according to their own lights. So Roosevelt defended what he was doing as a proper constitutionalism, but it was not the constitutionalism of the framers. Thank you. Come back.
Want to come sit down? And people have questions?
I'm sure you know this book, Atlantic Crossings, by the professor at Princeton, who claims that he shows that the progressive movement is an international movement. And England, France, Germany, all these countries are reacting against free enterprise, essentially, and worried about our corporations. And they think they have to create, well, I don't think this is the real story, but this is a story that's claimed, and that they develop, but they also imitate corporations in their methods of control. The problem with the U.S. is all those countries didn't have a constitution. We had a written constitution, which prevented, in theory, people from doing that. But I'm wondering if you are aware of influence on TR from abroad, because this is something that's very noticeable in the progressive movement even today, that there's kind of international elites who push progressive nostrums on the country, and that gives them some of their self-confidence that they're representing the latest thing. Is that also the case with TR? Do we also have sort of international conversations?
Yes, I can answer that at several levels. First of all, when he was a young boy, he spent the year 1873 in Germany, learning German, but right after German unification. And he pronounced himself a great lover of German culture, the German language, German poetry. He was an admirer of many aspects of German culture and civilization. The progressive, you're right, many of the progressives, not Roosevelt, but many of the progressive intellectuals, and I do take this up in my book, had studied abroad because America had no graduate schools. Henry Cabot Lodge was one of the first PhDs at Harvard in the history department, and that was 1876. So the generation prior to Theodore Roosevelt had to go abroad, and mostly when they went abroad, they went to German universities. And Gifford Pinchot, for instance, went abroad to study this I think is hilarious. His father made a fortune in the lumber business. So then he goes abroad to study forestry in Europe and comes back and says, they're pillaging everything over here. We have to adopt German methods where the state manages all natural resources. So although Roosevelt himself did not go abroad or study abroad, many of the people he associated with and many of the progressive intellectuals who were in the universities had studied abroad. So that one of the interesting things is that when Roosevelt goes in 1910, after he steps down from the presidency in 1909, he goes on safari, and then he goes and makes a whirlwind tour of all the European capitals. He gives speeches everywhere. But he also met with all of the reformers. He wanted to know how old age pensions worked. He wanted to know about cooperative farming. He wanted to know about health care, because England was about to put in a health care system in 1911. So he met with all these reformers, and he came back to the United States and thought that the United States was really falling behind the curve. His talk in Germany was called The World Movement, which he delivered in Berlin. So again, I think this is another difference. If you think of Hamilton in the Federalist Papers saying, we are exceptional, we are going to teach Europe a lesson. And now TR comes back from Europe and says, even Hungary is more advanced than we are. They have a museum of farming life, and we don't, and I'm ashamed of that. So yes, the German and European influence, in the sense that you were caught up in this great historic moment. When Jane Addams seconded his nomination at the Progressive Party convention, she said what was distinctive about Roosevelt was that he had caught the modern movement. And so it was to the everlasting shame that Americans were dragging their heels and not becoming part of what was, a sort of globalization. Does that?
Yeah, I was going to follow that up with a question about the national parks, whether that was influenced by German land legislation, because that struck me. I've never seen that connection made, but I started to wonder it a few weeks ago when the national parks came out. Turned out to be a very much an instrument of the government. As the German land legislation was originally intended, but maybe that's just to obscure a point. So.
I have to say that I did spend some time on conservation, on TR's conservation efforts and uncovered a lot of things and put them together, but I have not come across that. So it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I haven't come across it. Martha?
Well, we've heard or can guess that Jean's book is terrific in content. What hasn't been said and needs saying is that it's just superbly crafted and a pleasure to read. But I have a follow-up comment really on what was just said.
Everything before the but, Martha.
Yeah. No. It was really just, I think of Strauss's term logographic necessity, and each word seems to perform a function. I'm not. It's very beautifully
Thank you.
read.
Thank you.
We're talking about the German influence, which you emphasize in your book. As it happens, after reading your book, I attended a conference based on the collection of American readings put together by the Casses and by Diana Shobe. And in that book, maybe you know, there's a speech, an astonishing speech by Roosevelt, pounding his listeners on the topic of Americanism, berating all things European and any influence that comes from that quarter. Well, I found this richly ironic. Well, ironic isn't quite the right word. Incongruous. I mean, he should know, given the extent to which he was under the influence of. And so, how did that, in his own mind, did he remain a sort of quintessential American, notwithstanding that influence, or what?
I have two responses to that. One is that's a very early speech. It's made in the 1890s, I believe, maybe even I think it's 1894. And what he's responding to is Woodrow Wilson's book arguing that America should become more like a parliamentary democracy. And so his American pride is wounded because he sees that as just we haven't really thrown off our colonial mentality. So I think that's really the context for his remarks there. And I certainly would not take that as Roosevelt's full-throated Americanism, because he also, in those speeches, talks about sordid materialism and American ideals is somehow being, there's a kind of idealism there. So he's not simply championing all that is all things American. But the other is that his indebtedness to Germany, I think, really does increase as time goes on. One of the things that's really astounding to me, and this is after he visits Germany, and I think Charnwood makes the point in his biography, a very admiring biography of Roosevelt, that there is no gainsaying the effect that Roosevelt's visiting Europe as a former president had upon him as he now begins to see the welfare states in their infancy, but to see the good that these policies are doing for the people. And one of the things that's really interesting to me is that even as he's calling for the United States to go to war against Germany, he's still saying, but we really ought to copy the Germans on the tariff. We really ought to copy the Germans on their industrial efficiency. We really ought to copy the Germans on their social policy. They may be too militaristic, but there's so much good in Germany. And I think you remember that the last line of my book was, before the epilogue, was something that here was a man who started his political career praising the Federalist and who died lamenting that America had not yet caught up with the Germans.
Rita.
So you talked about the two sort of prongs of this Pincher movement, on the one hand direct democracy and on the other hand technocracy. Is there some kind of principled sphere distinction between what direct democracy can be put in charge of and what technocracy ought to be put in charge of? Or did he not see these as eventually going to come into conflict inevitably?
I don't think he saw that they would come into conflict. His idea, and again, I mean, there was a tide in human affairs here, and it looked as if the country was about to really have this great social democratic swell. And so the technocrats would give the people the things that they wanted, but this was what the people wanted. And as astonishing as it seems to us with 100 years of hindsight, I don't think he saw it all, nor I think did any of the early progressives see that there would be a tension between what the people wanted and what the technocrats were offering. So.
Not even false consciousness. That's the usual line used today, right? That people don't know what they want, but if they knew better. They don't have that idea of false consciousness in the people?
No, they don't need that idea of false consciousness because they think that everybody's really on the same page. That the Westerners who have put into practice the direct democratic reforms are all progressives. Now, in the epilogue, I do talk about the unintended consequences of progressivism, and one. A long time ago, in fact, at a Liberty Fund conference that got me really started on this whole project, run by Jim Caesar and John Dinan, we read a piece in which all progressive, all initiatives and referenda and judicial recall, how often have they been used to undo progressive legislation? And Harvey, you know something about this in a personal way with judicial recall. But it's almost 50% of the time. So this whole idea that the people and their wise and benevolent administrators would all be on the same page turned out not to be true at all. But they just simply, it's in a way it's very surprising, but they thought that this was simply the cause of the right and the good. And again, the people, you had a lot of magazines, new journals, women's journals for the first time, mobilizing opinion. Eldon Eisenach talks about that in his book on progressivism, the extent to which you now have new ways of forming opinion and mobilizing it so that it looked as if all the enlightened people were on the same side. And I would just add another effect of the progressive movement was to have more ideological parties. Roosevelt was one of the first to say, in effect, the progressives were, well, progressive, right-thinking, and the alternative were the ultra-conservatives or reactionaries. And he thought that that was a winning hand. If you cast political parties in those terms, there was no doubt where the vast majority of people would wind up, especially in a forward-looking country. Shep.
I really like to second Martha's praise to the book. It's really a wonderful book. And the clarity of your thought exposes the muddled nature of Roosevelt's thought.
So people have said to me, why did you spend 12 years on a guy like this?
And so I've been trying to think about the sources of the change. I mean, you really provide such a rich picture of the many sources of his thought. I just trying to tick some of them off as German idealism and German historicism more generally, social Darwinism, which you didn't say much about here, but features very prominently in the book. Mm-hmm. The kind of admiration for Germany, not Bismarck, and kind of reducing social conflict, which he saw as really central, and kind of democratic impulse. So if you want to try to sort out, there's this debate about the relevance of any of these and how important is Hegel, how important is American democracy. So the problem seems to be they all seem to be pointing in the same direction, towards paying very little attention to the framers, very little attention to the Federalists, and demotion of natural rights. And actually, I think the panel we were on, Jim Caesar, if I understood him correctly, said throughout the second half of the 19th century, there was surprisingly little attention to individual rights or to the Federalists. So he was
After
really,
the Civil War, yeah.
Right. So how do you if you want to try to sort out the importance of any of these influences, how do you do that? Are there some features of his thought you can see coming from, say, social Darwinism or others from German historicism?
The way in which I tried to do it was chronologically, because I think that his thought really does change over time. Early on, he is very much, I think, enthralled to social Darwinism. After all, when he was an undergraduate at Harvard, his major was the natural, well, they didn't have majors, but his concentration was the natural sciences. And so his concentration was the natural sciences, not political science or government or political economy. And I think he was very drawn to those ideas up to the time when he becomes governor of New York. And in part, what I try to argue is that as the scope of his political ambition expands, he begins to take in new influences. He meets new people. He meets Jacob Riis. He begins to make the acquaintance of progressives. Progressives are gaining ground. They're more in evidence, and he sees new social problems that he hadn't seen before. And I think he sort of steps back somewhat from the social Darwinism. And there is more over time. And again, one of the really hard things for me was looking for the moment when did Roosevelt become a progressive? You know, when did everything turn? And there really, as far as I could see, there really wasn't a defining moment, though of course you try to fasten on something. And I thought that it was the midterm elections. And by the way, I have to say that writing the book on the centennial of all Roosevelt's midterm elections and having it come out on the centennial of the 1912 election with progressivism very much on the ballot last year, it just gave all of this research, a real immediacy. But I think that it was the 1906 elections where Western insurgents began to gather force, and he then begins to really make a turn toward more progressive policies. But I also think, again, Roosevelt was a real speed reader. It was said of him that he read a book a day while he was president in the White House. How well he read them is another question, but he was an energetic, as he was in everything, but he certainly just devoured books, so I think that it could be any one book. Certainly also it was Crowley, I think, in 1910. I'd make a big deal out of the Crowley book. But I think it was also the experience of being an executive as opposed to the experience of being a legislator, a New York assemblyman, a member of the Civil Service Commission. That somehow his outlook broadened, and the people he consulted with certainly broadened, Shep. So again, as he said when he ran against Wilson in 1912, that he had not come by his progressivism by studying in the closet. He wasn't an academic, but that he had learned it through life, and I think there's some reason to think that that's true. But how all these things come together and how he can hold all of these different ideas, because they do exist in his head, sometimes simultaneously, not always successfully.
Yes.
So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what the opposing discourse was like and what it meant to the sort of conversation we're having. So if TR wasn't a constitutionalist, as it were, who were constitutionalists and why? And because I mean, to me, the looming sort of date is 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, and I mean, if that's the sort of interpretations of the Constitution that are sort of in the debate at the time, then I can see why it would be very hard to be a constitutionalist, and so who's making constitutionalist arguments to what end? How does that structure the discourse?
Well, it's interesting that you should say Plessy versus Ferguson, because it doesn't figure at all in progressivism. One of the interesting things about progressivism is that it was very much concerned with the rights of the working class, people who worked in factories, questions of workers' compensation, hours, wages, but racial discrimination. Roosevelt when invited Booker T. Washington to the White House, you may know that, and the entire establishment rose up against him, that this was such a terrible thing to have done. And again, in 1912, Roosevelt supported a policy called the Lilly-White policy, in which there would be no black delegates to the Progressive Convention from the South, because he was hoping in that way he could pick off some of the progressives who were in the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, and they would all fall in line behind the progressives. So in effect, acknowledging that racial justice was not a big part of the progressive picture.
But leaving aside the issue of race, I just picked.
Well, Lochner versus New York would be, or the Knight decision, and Lochner versus New York would be better.
Yeah. So what were the Democrats saying at this time? I mean, like, were people using the Constitution? Nowadays, we're very used to people using the Constitution as a political bludgeon. So, I mean, was that happening? Did the Constitution have a certain, as it were, political meaning beyond this sort of? In TR.
Well, from the progressive point of view, it did. They saw all these decisions as simply affirming something that they abstractly referred to as laissez-faire. And again, one of the things that I've tried to do in my book is to say it would be really wonderful, though it would require for an untenured graduate student or an untenured professor a great deal of courage to go back and really examine some of these narratives that have been so entrenched in the national consciousness, the robber barons, laissez-faire, government opposed to any kind of social reform, because in fact, most state constitutions were making changes to improve the plight of the working man and working woman. There were just a few that stood out as the exceptions, but some of those were in the state Roosevelt hailed from, New York, and so he took it as a personal affront. But if I can go back to your original question, I think the way I'm hearing or the way I'd like to reframe it is what at the time were the alternatives to progressivism. And the interesting thing for me is that Root and Lodge were on board with Roosevelt's new nationalism. Root said, what's new about this new nationalism? I mean, these people did not see that Roosevelt was significantly reinterpreting the right to property and reducing its protections by saying, well, now you have to meet this test. Has your property rendered service to the nation? Has it done good to the community? If it hasn't, then you don't really have a claim to it. Or if you've been paid too much, how much is too much, and who decides? What is a benefit? All of those questions that immediately you start thinking about with the new nationalism speech. They were on board for that. What they opposed was judicial recall. That was the rallying cry for the progressives within the Republican Party. Now, recently, Bill Shambra has done some very good work, wrote a very suggestive essay called Saviors of the Constitution, in which he goes through Root and Lodge and Taft and the arguments that they made. But certainly, I would say this is an area that really needs a lot more exploration, because if you say this was the wrong path, and you can say, well, the political science of the framers is really superior, but then the practical question is, who was offering that? And so one would have to go back with open eyes and not just accept the progressive narrative, but look at this to see just what kind of an alternative it was.
There was that. I'm sorry.
On Plessy versus Ferguson, there were two sides.
Oh, please do.
Understanding, there was a constitutional tradition there, which was Justice Harlan's. I mean, if that had been the majority, then that, I think, would have been a constitutional position, one certainly much better for the country.
I was going to mention the debate, famous debate between Taft and TR on executive power and the extent of it, and Taft's attack on the stewardship theory.
Oh,
And,
from which I...
and Roosevelt's defense of it against, I guess it was in Taft's memoirs.
It's in his book on the executive,
Yeah.
when he was at the Yale Law School.
Yeah,
So
So it's
after
later.
after
This
they
is-
both lost the election.
this is later.
Yes, but
Yeah.
what happened was Roosevelt published his autobiography in 1913.
Yeah.
And Taft really was responding to that, because Roosevelt had earlier, while he was president, said, I belong to the Jackson-Lincoln School, and I don't belong to the Buchanan School. And then in the autobiography, he said the Buchanan-Taft School. And so Taft felt that he had to defend himself. And it's a wonderful book from
Yes,
and
it's
part
very
of the arguments
comical
that
parts, yes. Yes,
Well,
the
thank
two of you, take turns.
I'm way over my head in this fascinating discussion, but let me play devil's advocate with a couple of questions that are not meant to be disrespectful, even if they sound like it. I'm just puzzled that you don't say more about Roosevelt as president, because he had been president for 8 years, and how this is possible for him to be the dangerous radical you seem to be describing puzzles me. My other question relates to the Federalist Papers. Would the principal author of the Federalist Papers have thought that the initiative, the recall, and the referendum would be a violation of the constitutional principles that he, I mean, the father of our Constitution, as he's known, would he have
Are you talking about
disapproved?
Madison or Hamilton?
Yeah, would he have disapproved of the recall, initiative, and referendum?
Yes to the second question, I think, because the whole, if you look at, for example, Federalist 10, Madison makes the argument for not just why we need representation, but why representation will be an improvement on direct democracy. So in that sense, I don't think a return to direct democracy on statewide or national questions would be anything that Madison would have supported. But I thought when you said the principal author of the Federalist, you meant Hamilton, because he is the principal author, even if Madison is regarded as the father of the Constitution. He's not the father of the Federalist Papers. As for your second question, I had a half an hour to talk about my book. And what I tried to do was just focus on constitutional questions because this is because of the particular mission of Harvey's program. And I thought that it would be good to talk about the stewardship theory. There are other instances of the stewardship theory during Roosevelt's presidency, but I thought to get a full sense of the flavor of the man, you could not leave out all of the post-presidential constitutional changes that he proposed. But believe me, it's all here. All you write to me when you after you read it.
Yes.
The first thing is I'm going to offer something to you that I should only make after having read your book. I will read your book, but I still want to, since you're here, I'd like to offer it to you based upon your own talk. And that is to say, you're looking for the issue, one of the issues is the contradictions in this man. And I think we often have a question in life in general, in all of our studies. Some people are simply full of contradictions, and it's more the norm than the exception. And that there are very few people who are so self-reflective that they look for some way of being coherent in all their positions. Now, I'd like to make an assumption. For the sake of argument, let's assume that Roosevelt was or was capable of being coherent rather than a collection of opinions. And I wonder, going back to what you said, might one not be able to explain his positions, first of all, based upon Freeman, which you introduced, that of all peoples in the world, the Anglo-Saxons had the greatest capacity to rule themselves and to rule others. So there is a special gift amongst Anglo-Saxons. And that when he comes to Burgess, you raise Hegel. I don't know how much Savigny Burgess might have introduced to him. But if he introduced a good whiff of Savigny, then a constitution is really an expression of the spirit of the people, not a written document. And that at a given time, perhaps the Federalists were an expression of that people, but later on things change. And that the people who are best able to judge the spirit of the people are not the people, but the judges, the jurists, as going back to Savigny. And in a sense, these commissions, the best people, are the ones thrown up by the better culture to explain to the people and rule in their behalf because they understand the people better than the people understand themselves. Would that make any sense?
Hi.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize.
Let me. I am fascinated by your distinction between the Anglo-Americans on the one hand and then the German culture on the other.
Well, it's not exactly a distinction because Savigny is a German and underlies this sort of view of the relationship of constitution to people.
But the what I'm thinking of is that the Anglo-American tradition is not a tradition that says impartial jurists and administrators can divine the will of the people. The Anglo-American tradition, especially the way in which Roosevelt learned it, was a bottom-up tradition of folk moots and townships and local self-government and people being vigilant with respect to their liberties. And then you have what you're suggesting is another tradition, and what would tie those two together would be historicism. We were once one people, and the spirit of the people evolved over time. One of the things that does happen, and here I think Roosevelt is quite good, is that you have large influxes of people coming from Europe in the middle of the 19th century. Many of the Germans who came here were German socialists who got kicked out of Germany after the Socialist Party was outlawed. And so they bring with them their culture, their spirit of the people, which they then try to infuse into the American culture and spirit of the people. So it's not clear which spirit is really predominating.
Well, I'm referring only to that Anglo-Dutchman named, that anglicized Dutchman named Roosevelt rather than to them. But may I ask you just two questions? One, stewardship. Any influence of the New Testament in that formulation of stewardship? Because you haven't mentioned his Christianity at all. And the other thing is, was there any reaction that Roosevelt had to the American Commonwealth, Lord Bryce's?
Oh, sure. He and Bryce were friends, and in fact, when he says that we don't need to worry about majority tyranny, he cites Bryce against Tocqueville. He knew Bryce personally and admired him. And Bryce, of course, wanted to do what Tocqueville had done, but of course he just burdened his book with lots of statistics that make it hardly in a league with Tocqueville's book. So yes, he knew Bryce. Now, what was your other question?
Stewardship. You mentioned stewardship,
Oh.
and I keep hearing the New Testament and Jesus on parable of the talents and all that, and I was wondering, and given his devotion at the local Episcopal church when he was undergraduate.
When he got kicked out.
Yes, well, he did teach Sunday school.
Until they discovered he wasn't an Episcopalian, and they kicked him out. But Roosevelt, although he was nominally a member of, well, he was Dutch Reformed, and then he and his wife were members of various Episcopal congregations. But mostly what he was, I think, for his mature life was somebody who belonged to the social gospel, which is to say that you emulate the life of Jesus, but there's no afterlife. You just do good works. And of course, one of the principal themes of his progressivism is, what is mine I will make thine in good measure also, and brother's keeper, you are your brother's keeper. So there are lots of ways in which Roosevelt's religion, I think, inflects his politics, but that's as social gospel, not so much anything else. As far as I know, no direct reference to scripture when he talks about stewardship. Stewardship first emerges as a term in his administration in connection with our Indian policy and the reservations.
But I remember a phrase in this Taft TR exchange that TR said of Taft, he accused him of wanting to keep his virtue wrapped in a napkin, which I think comes from Scripture.
Yes, that's true.
Something you mustn't do.
That's in the it's in the autobiography, speaking of himself, that he did not believe that the steward of the people should hide his light, keep his
hide his light under a bushel.
It's not hide. It's hide. Wrap it up in a napkin.
Wrap it up in a napkin.
Which is hiding your light under a bushel.
Yes, Becky.
On the contemporary relevance of this historical study, I mean, it's said that we have a progressive president in the White House. I was surprised when I first came here to Harvard to have fellow graduate students describing themselves as progressives. I had to Google that to figure out exactly what they meant. And obviously times have changed. Certainly the welfare state makes whatever progressivism means today different than in TR's time. Nevertheless, I wonder if there are certain commonalities. I mean, for instance, what you might think of this, he spoke about these contradictions that you locate in his thinking, and I wonder if to what extent they're just endemic in the American national character, because Americans are supposedly a forward-looking people. That sounds like they're all by nature progressives, and yet they have this admiration for the founding. So that's bound to produce endless contradictions or conflicts of some kind. So are his contradictions sort of very American in character, or are they more idiosyncratically his own? And how might that relate to what you see now? You think with Obama, it's strange. He seems to be explicitly opposed to American exceptionalism, as that term is normally understood, but he also seems to be a national greatness leader of some kind, however he understands that. So that would
I'm glad you asked those series of questions, because I would like to take this moment to say that my book does not focus primarily on Roosevelt's contradictions. The contradictions emerge in the course of the study, but I did not set out to prove that Roosevelt was contradicting himself. So that's a kind of byproduct just of looking at his entire program. I think that one thing about progressivism is that it doesn't have an end point. And so what was progressive in 1910 could look very reactionary today. For instance, Roosevelt's thoughts about women. Roosevelt supported woman suffrage, as it was called, only tepidly until he really needed them in the election of 1912. He thought that most women should stay home, be with their families. He did have unmarried women working as part of his brain trust, but certainly that would not make him look very progressive today. He thought he was a firm believer in chastity and sexual purity. He thought that men and women should marry early and not fiddle around beforehand or after. And they should have a lot of children. All of these ideas, quickly, with the roaring 20s, looked to be very old-fashioned. So just to give you a few examples, and it's very hard to know where Roosevelt would come down on the major social issues of the day, because I think in terms of his social views, he was really what we would say, fairly conventional or even conservative. His progressivism had to do with his views of what the government ought to be doing in order to redistribute wealth. National greatness, yes, but Roosevelt's national greatness really was a greatness, I think, that was relative to the strength and power of other nations. That we were a continental republic, we should have a military that was the equivalent of any military in the world. We should use it for good and as a deterrent. And I think that's where his sense of national greatness principally lay. I certainly don't see President Obama thinking of national greatness in terms of foreign policy. If he has a conception of greatness, and I'm not even sure that he does, I think what he's replaced greatness with is an emphasis on social justice, and I think social justice for him is greater than greatness.
I had a question about this. I was trying to think about all the differences between his progressivism and ours today. Greatness, religion, virtue, Lincoln is, and also another thing that struck me was economics. That today, in today's progressivism or liberals, economics is very important. And whereas I have the impression that in Roosevelt's day, an economist was conservative, and that there wasn't any Keynes yet, or any proto-Keynes that to whom progressives could appeal, even though the experts were technocratic. They were going to be experts in political science or public administration, and not so much economists.
Oh, Roosevelt himself had no interest in economics, and he said so repeatedly. And in fact, when he looked at the progressive movement and he looked at reform, he saw it always as a moral question, not an economic question. And so the economic question sort of fell by the wayside. You know, would the railroads prosper if we did this? Well, he said he cared, but since those questions were really kind of beneath him, he never found economic questions interesting. But yet, it was the economy, and again, you can say he was very naive, because he thought that you could have really quite a top-down regulated economy, and yet you would never discourage businessmen from continuing to produce the wealth that was the precondition for the redistribution of it.
So what kind of redistribution did he favor? And what about his famous remark about male factors of great wealth that he railed against in his angry meeting with, was it J.P. Morgan, or who treated him, he said, as though I were just a rival businessman?
He, the comment about the malefactors of wealth was occasioned by the collapse of the market in 1907, and he thought that that it was a collusion of business interests which had worked to bring about this economic catastrophe, and he even admitted that perhaps it was his policy statements that had caused them to respond in the way that they responded. So he saw them as malefactors of wealth. But the thing about, again, in 1907, there weren't very many rules and regulations about what a malefactor of wealth was. We didn't have an SEC. We didn't have much in the way of regulation, and certainly some regulation was in order. But for Roosevelt, it was basically, were you cooperating with me or were you not? There were good trusts and there were bad trusts, and the standard was, J.P. Morgan was actually one of the good trusts. Judge Gary, who was one of one of J.P. Morgan's top guys, said to Roosevelt, look, just tell us what you want us to do. Tell us what we should charge and how we should go about it, and we'll do it. And if you were willing to cooperate with Roosevelt in that way, Roosevelt thought you were a good trust, and he wasn't going to prosecute you, as compared with the bad trusts. Rockefeller, for instance. Rockefeller said, bring it on. And Roosevelt did. So, if I can put wrap that thought up a little more, one of the things that happened when we first began to think about how do you bring these corporations to heel, Roosevelt's first thought was, I will decide, and I will set the rules, and everyone will come to the bargaining table with me, and if you play ball with me, and again, you have, I really do shy away from drawing any conclusion about this in my book, but this kind of top-down corporate state and business cooperating with each other, with business taking its order from the state. It sounds almost like a form of liberal fascism. One doesn't know. Roosevelt didn't live long enough to know what he would have made of the 1920s and Mussolini. Certainly Crowley, who was the head of the New Republic in the early 1920s, was very taken with the European intellectual fascists. I'm not talking about the 1930s when they become violent and brown shirts, but in the very early years, Croce, fascinated with that.
Crowley, you mean?
Yes, yes. So the malefactors of wealth, when Roosevelt makes that pronouncement, it's really hard to know, because with Roosevelt it was really personal. And what you needed were institutions that weren't going to depend just on the judgment of one man, who was good and who was bad. And there was an awful lot of, if you cooperate with me, then you're one of the good trusts.
Well, really comparable to FDR's phrase, economic royalists.
Well, yeah. I think FDR
Comparable.
learned a lot from TR. Throwing out the money there was throwing out the money changers, but there was also chasing the special interests out of politics. One thing about Roosevelt, although I said he was a social gospeler, he really knew scripture. And there are many of his speeches are filled with scriptural references.
Well, thanks so much, Jean. This has been quite wonderful.
Thank you.